Good afternoon and welcome to episode 4 of Data Matters. I'm Vickie and I'm here with my business partner Steve Wright, and I'm so happy to announce, joined by who Steve described as a heavyweight data protection practitioner and author, Ardi Kolah. Welcome, Ardi.
Well, thank you very much. But just to correct factually, Steve, I'm not that fat.
Well, this afternoon looks like it might be lots of fun. I don't know about you, but this week does feel a little bit quieter. I don't know whether that's because we're in the run up to Easter now, and some people are actually taking time off at home, or at least from the computer. I think there's a bit of recognition now perhaps that we could be in for the long haul. So we've seen a lot of topics. For example, we were just talking now about working from home in a secure and private way. There's been a lot of information flooding LinkedIn around that perhaps people are now starting to think, well, perhaps we should sit back and start to consider things a little bit more of a slow release, because we have time to be considerate. We know that none of us are infallible. We've seen the Prime Minister, unfortunately, who has been struck down with coronavirus and has been described as battling it. And interestingly, I don't know if you saw Emily make this on Newsnight last night, actually trying to correct that language and saying, hold on a minute, should we really be describing this as a battle? Does that mean that, we win or lose? Because that's not the case. Just because we might be a strong constitution, we may not win this. My personal view is that we've just got to surrender to this right now. And in that surrender, we need to consider things like how important data is. If we're going to think about fighting this, actually data is so significant in this. Quality data, we've seen that testing is absolutely paramount in really sort of understanding how widespread this is. So by understanding that data, we need to, of course, be considerate of how we're going to look after it. It just seems a world away from the general data protection regulation when we were looking at, how are we going to hold on to this, and, looking at consumers, and consumers were feeling as if so much or too much was being done with their data. Right now, the NHS are actually asking for us to provide that data via things like symptom checkers, so that we can actually look at, what those symptoms are. What does this actually look like? How are we actually going to manage this? Which is really interesting, and it's been a complete shift. Now, the Information Commissioner has called, for example, for pragmatism particularly around things like, how we're going to handle data breaches during this crisis. But as I do have these heavyweights in the room with us today, I now want to ask them, how is this shift going to manifest itself? For example, in business as usual, in how consumers actually think and feel about data, now that they can actually see what can be used in the public interest. So going back to this NHS symptom checker, for example, I can actually share very personal, very sensitive data, but it's in the public interest. So I'm going to do that. So that feels legitimate to me. If anything happens to that data, what do you think the view, for example, of the Information Commissioner is going to be then? So I'm just going to hand over to Steve to start with, just to talk about what we think pragmatism actually means in this context.
Thanks, Vickie. I'm delighted to be joined today by Ardi Kolah, who is a heavyweight in this area and not in his body mass. Okay, so just to be clear, let's just clarify.
Clear that up, Steve. That's very important.
I have a great deal of time and respect for this man. He is incredibly well versed in all things privacy and data protection. So I'm really honoured that he could take time to join us today. So, I think with your question, Vickie, it is a good one, and it's the one that's certainly playing on my mind at the moment. But I have to sort of almost take a step back and think which I have been doing a lot about, the privacy implications of having these devices in our homes now. And I think we touched on this in previous weeks about, you know, it's opening up new areas of thought about our responsibilities, where they start and where they begin with our employers in terms of infrastructure, and how much should I give in terms of, you know, invasion into my own privacy. So there's a sort of, I think you touched on it earlier on in your intro about, there's more of a wider question about is this going to fundamentally change the way we think about privacy? And I do believe it will. It's going to redefine what we traditionally thought was, well, that's work stuff and this is home stuff. And now we've got this very confused, merged state of play, which is a blending of everything. And I don't know, with the organisations that I look after, I don't know what that boundary is anymore. It's become seamless and invisible and very difficult to identify. And you know, it was strange because in the past, and it feels like, you know, yesteryear, in the past, I would have either had switched off my phone or switched off or closed my laptop, and that was the end of it now. But now it feels like it's sort of morphed into my home life as well. And I feel very much as if, I mean, I'm very spoiled because I have an office, but I feel very much as if it's become a different way of thinking about what privacy is, and how this is having an impact. And I think I'll turn to Ardi at this point, but I'll come back to the question around the regulator, because I think that it's not just the UK regulator, that all the regulators are giving different sort of views, if you like. They're coming at it slightly different. Same principles apply all across the EU, but I think it's worth just turning over to Ardi.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me today. I don't regard myself as being a heavyweight on anything, really. I'm sure lots of people who are much more experienced than me are tuning in and listening, and obviously this is an opportunity for them to also ask questions, but also to contribute. But whilst I've got the microphone, I think, Vickie, going back to your earlier point about privacy, I think we've got to see it in a slightly different way, in my humble opinion. We've got to see it from the business point of view, the organisation point of view, and we need to see it from the individual's point of view, the consumer, the right, you know, the individual, and the data subject, as we call it in privacy jargon, if you like. What's happening at the moment, there's a lot of commentary about the fact that people are having to work from home, and I think we've covered that already in some of these other episodes, and we don't have to kind of rehearse what that looks like. But what's interesting is a lot of people, even privacy professionals, are a bit conflicted right now, and they're conflicted because they want their kids to be online. They want their kids to share experiences with their mates who they can't go out on a bike ride with or can't kick a ball in the park with, etc. My own two are going a bit stir crazy here. Hopefully they'll keep the noise down behind me. And it's very important that we try to give those children that childhood experience that perhaps we had without all this corona business when we were kids. And it's very difficult. And I was reading something this morning as I was standing in the queue waiting to get into a supermarket, which was an interesting experience in itself. I was reading something that a lady had said, I wasn't going to read the terms and conditions that this, I won't mention the social media company, had put together, because my kids were desperate to try to get in and do stuff and see their friends. And I'm conflicted. I thought that was quite interesting. The flip side is you've got commentary about the big social media companies hoovering up masses and masses of personal data now, because people are desperate to continue to keep in social contact. They're not going to bother about, well, actually, I don't agree with clause 3.5 and not use the service. They'd rather take the risk now, get people to communicate in the way that we're doing now. I don't think we're using TikTok, just in case you're wondering. I think we're using Teams. So, you know, we're not really reading the fine print. Even you and me and others don't necessarily want to read the fine print. But what someone did say was, okay, let's just hang fire in terms of how we would normally look at things at the moment, because it's a very weird time that we're all living through. But when we come out of this, perhaps we should just delete our accounts and start again. And I thought that was quite interesting. I'm not taking any credit for that point of view, but I thought there were two really interesting points of view. The point of view of the business, who bring up data, and maybe that's actually adding value for them post COVID-19, where we've actually got a greater data lake that people have appeared to want to share their personal information with. And then we've got people, parents and kids, who frankly, you know what, bless you, Steve, you know what, who don't really want to read the fine print. They just want to get online and have a laugh, because you can't go out and kick a ball and you can't go out and ride your bike.
I think that's a really, really good point, actually, Ardi. I saw something on LinkedIn today about media consumption patterns across generations. You might have seen that under COVID-19. And what I found really interesting was that actually the people that were sort of least trustworthy of the media source of data were at both ends of the spectrum. So they were either at the boomer end or they were at the sort of Generation Z end of the spectrum. So I think there is, as you say, some recognition that this stuff is going on, but it kind of comes back to that point around legitimate interest. And Steve, we didn't really get a chance to dig into that last week as much as I think we wanted to, because there was so much focus, and quite rightly at the time, on web conferencing. But I kind of come back to that, you know, as Ardi's pointing out, you know, after this, when we're starting to sweep up, do you think because the public potentially, because they might have time to start figuring out that they are sharing more of their personal data to help in the public interest, particularly their health data, will they actually start to think about, hold on a minute, I do understand a bit more about what legitimate interest means now in other areas, such as Ardi was speaking of there, around social media, for example. What do you think, Steve?
Well, yeah, I know I didn't answer that one last week, and I'd kind of had enough. So apologies for that to my business partner there, because I did cut you down a little bit there. I think so. You're right, Vicky. The question is a good one, and I think it came. I can't recall, but I think it came from the audience, which is always good. And we do encourage your questions to come in, as Ardi mentioned. Look. The truth is, we are in obviously unprecedented times, and the question about how do we respect privacy, you know, during and then post is one that's being debated quite heavily from all walks of life, from all different organisations. I think you know, what the lawful basis is, that's what I think the question that came through last week was around what's the lawful basis, and I think that's what's coming into question, because now people are becoming more educated and understand more. And you know, when I think back when I was data protection officer for John Lewis, and you know, there was all the stress running up to May the 25th 2018, it was all about sort of, can we reconsent, can we get permission, and then we bombarded millions of our customers with those requests. And you know, the big question mark back then was, well, will the customer really understand this? Would they actually, if they get asked, you know, do you want to be opted in, what the hell does that mean? So I think what's happened over the last 2 years, and now this is taken into a slightly different territory, which Ardi nicely articulated, is very much around, well, hang on a minute, I'm now aware that my data can be used. And we've got examples like Cambridge Analytica, which we know, you know, if you've watched the film or read the various papers on it, that actually our data does have a value, and it, you know, and it will get exploited and it will be used, and perhaps not on the correct lawful basis, and certainly not from our best interests at heart. And that's fundamentally what GDPR looked to achieve and has and is achieving. So you could say on a more wider scale that actually the result of GDPR and the Data Protection Act here in the UK is having a much more profound effect on how we all individually think about privacy. I mean, when I got into privacy about 10, 12 years ago, it was dry and boring. I mean, it still can be dry and boring, but now it's regarded as interesting and a little bit sexy. It's not quite, I'm not a cybersecurity guy at the front line, defending the networks, but I'm actually trying, all of us in privacy are trying to defend the rights and the freedoms of those individuals, and we stand up collectively as the vanguard for those rights. So it does, you're right, there is a change happening in the world, in society, especially in the EU and Western societies, where we are really beginning to question, well, hang on, what's the lawful basis by which you're processing my data? I don't remember giving you consent. But Ardi, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, my thoughts is listening to what you were saying, Steve, was quite a, not to be rude, was quite a Eurocentric view, because of course GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, was born from the European Union. And if you go back in time and look at the genesis of it, actually the genesis of GDPR wasn't in fact data privacy, which may shock most of you or may not. The genesis was actually about competition. It was about freedom of choice. It was about, in fact, trying to put a framework around the world's largest single digital market of 500 million consumers. Of course, that's less now because the UK is now out of the European Union. But if we took Europe as a whole, it's about 500 million consumers, right? And actually, it was about trying to stimulate growth. It was actually trying to lower barriers of entry to allow more competition, etc., etc. And of course, over time, the pendulum swung, because we saw an incidence of data breaches going up and up and up, a bit like the COVID virus statistics you see on the telly at 5 o'clock, which always scares the life out of me, by the way. Those graphs look really worrying. But all of a sudden you could look at that and think, pretend it's not COVID, think about it as data breaches, and you kind of still have the same effect, that it still worries you. And so the pendulum swung the other way, where we became much more sensitized to the fact that actually our personal data was being accessed and it was in the hands of other people. The reason I said about Steve being a bit Eurocentric is because it's quite easy, being in the UK and being in Europe, to look upon the world as being a bit like, well, we've got the highest standards. Well, actually, I spent a lot of time working in the US as well, in what I do, and the California Consumer Privacy Act, which some of you may have heard of, some of you may not have done. It's not quite the same as GDPR, but what it does do is it tends to reflect the fact that we are all globally becoming much more tuned into the fact that we've got our own rights, if you like, and as the GDPR calls it, rights and freedoms and interests, if you like. So we've all got those. The issue about putting a value on them, I think the jury is still out. But interestingly, in the CCPA, actually, you can buy someone's personal data in a commercial way, provided you've exposed how you're going to calculate what its value is, which is quite interesting because it's actually quite hard to do. But I think eventually we will get to a point where people can have an economic view in terms of what their personal data is valued at, if you like. And so from a global perspective, and of course, Steve and I work on the Journal of Data Protection and Privacy, and a lot of the articles that he peer reviews and I'm editing the journal, we're seeing a huge move. Thank you for the plug. That we're seeing a huge move towards a global standard, if you like. So the GDPR isn't necessarily that new. In many respects, it's codifying what good practice has been for some time. There's Convention 108, which has in fact been around much longer, 108 plus now, for example, which countries are outside of the EU are still following data protection standards. So actually, I think, and I'll be interested to hear what others feel, and please do ask questions and do come into the conversation. Are we moving towards a global view in terms of what data protection, data privacy looks like, rather than from a Eurocentric one?
Okay, so just whilst we wait for some builds on that from the audience, just coming back to what we were talking about around the collection of data under COVID-19, we had a question in to say, or to ask whether we shared the view that, or the concern that when tools such as the NHS app are installed to help the handling of COVID-19 data, the governments, perhaps they might want to stay active because they could come in handy after the coronavirus situation has ended. So I see Steve is nodding his head there. So what do you think about that, Steve?
Well, I think I don't want to sort of repeat what we said last week, but we are in very unique times, and it calls for collaboration and data sharing in order, if we're going to analyse and ultimately eradicate this horrible, dreadful virus. I think the framework by which we do that is what's going to be questionable. How we do it and how we do that in a secure way. There's plenty of guidance out there, and we should make sure that we're adhering to that. I know I've used it a couple of times, but we need to self-police ourselves and ask us both, moral and ethical questions as to whether there's a vital interest or some other public interest in handling this data. So I do think that because of the unprecedented times, it calls for a really different view to make sure we get that data across. We don't want doctors and scientists being held up by red tape, but by the same token, there are techniques, anonymisation, etc., and encryption to protect that anonymity and just generally try to safeguard our rights and those principles. And I think that's going back to your earlier point about the regulators, that those principles, everyone's drawing back on those. And Ardi's quite right. Round one to Ardi. He's got right, because I was looking at that in a bit of a Europhile type of view.
Well, no, that's understandable. That wasn't a criticism really, because I think many of us would probably default to that, Steve. So that was just a bit of a laugh. But just again, Vickie, coming back to you, there's a lot of discussion amongst governments about how they can monitor the spread of this disease, which is actually very important, because having had the World Health Organization say it's a pandemic, that means it's everywhere, not just in certain communities. And one of the things that Israel is thinking about doing is creating an app on a mobile phone, which you, if you like, can track the journey of that disease amongst communities, where actually you can find out yourself from your smartphone whether someone actually who's close to you may have had it or indeed has it. And I think we haven't got to that point yet. And I know that we're talking about potentially giving people more control over what's happening around them. And certainly this has a public health interest aspect to it completely. And as Steve had mentioned, provided that we're not infringing the rights and freedoms and interests of individuals, so we can anonymize this data, if you like, in some way. I haven't quite worked out how you do that if you think someone coming towards you may have got it, because how could that be anonymous? But let's just say the principle is we're trying to take a huge amount of data points, we're trying to anonymize that and trying to give people a better way of how they can get back into society and how they can manage their time without becoming ill, if you like. At the moment, it's a bit medieval in my view. We don't know who's got it. We haven't tested enough people, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to lock you away. And by the way, we don't know how long that's going to be, except, of course, today in the news, they said it's for another 4 weeks, which, of course, would be very worrying indeed if you're a child and you just don't know where this is going to end. And your whole world's been changed, if you like. So it's a bit medieval. Other people are talking about, how about if we only isolated and protected and shielded, they use that word shield a bit, not privacy shield, Steve, shield. And how can we shield people who are vulnerable, who have got underlying health conditions, who are of a certain age? Can we not focus our attentions on shielding them and then testing the rest of the population, and then knowing that actually we can get the economy back on its feet, which actually is important, because who knows how long this is going to go on for, but we have to earn money to pay for the great work that our colleagues in the NHS are doing, and to provide them with the kit and equipment they need. Absolutely.
It really is a dichotomy, isn't it, Ardi? Completely. And then if I now sort of try and bring it back from there onto the GDPR specifically, we've got a question here. Do you believe that responses to the current GDPR roadmap will have any impact on the legislation? I don't know if you can answer that in the context of the responses that you're aware of, and also in the context of the current environment. So open to either of you, or we could come back to that.
Well, just a quick one. The European Data Protection Board recently have undertaken to look at GDPR. They made some outline judgments as to the way it was working. They felt it was working. There's going to be improvements. They're under a statutory obligation to do that under the GDPR as well, as we know. And the GDPR does have some mechanism built in, so it can be updated as technology moves forward and perhaps as other things change in society. But in reality, GDPR is still pretty new. As a piece of regulation, there are still organizations who are still not compliant with it. So, we're not at a point where everyone knows how to comply with it. I do think that what's happened at the moment is stopping and giving pause for thought in terms of the balance between public interest and the right to privacy. And it certainly comes up in many ways. For example, and I'll give you an example I was talking to Steve about the other night, where perhaps you could have a nursery and someone has a key worker in that nursery. That nursery is now closed, and the children don't really understand, because they're 3, for example. They don't really understand why they can't go to nursery anymore, see their friends. And so maybe having a friendly face via social media, doing something with those children, maybe that's a good thing. But of course, the flip side of that is, if we've got colleagues in organizations that we're working with or working for who are furloughed, actually the law prevents them from working, because actually that then removes the basis for the repayment to the employer if that person is working, clearly, because they can't be furloughed. Do you understand? So basically there are some practical reasons, as well as the fact that we hadn't perhaps envisaged having that person's details being shared with others, because that wasn't the data privacy notice. That certainly wasn't our intention. If we were to try to change that, we would have to go back and unpack that, if you like. And of course, in this situation, that's not practical.
Absolutely. So I picked up on the point you made there, Ardi, about what we say in our privacy notices as well. So, Steve, is it time that everybody went back and started looking at what we're saying in our privacy notices? Is this the time to do that now?
Well, I think that the privacy notices, I always maintain, should be regularly reviewed and updated. They're a living, breathing document. I think with a dose of pragmatism and realism, if you like, I don't think anyone's that's going to be top of their list right now. But it does raise the question about, some of the companies that I look after support, they're still operating, I think, again, to Ardi's point, they're still operating internationally. Business is still going on, and they're being asked the types of questions that we've touched on here about data sharing and other similar matters. So I think, it's true. Your policy, your privacy notice, your way of explaining to your customers, to your clients, of how, and what you're doing with the data, etc., needs to be relevant and up to date. So I don't think it doesn't sit on the shelf per se. It should be constantly reviewed and edited. And in fact, only last week I had a Teams meeting with one of my clients, and we agreed to make a change to the privacy notice. Now, it's nothing to do with COVID, it's to do with other data sharing, third parties, etc. But we realised, we looked at it as part of we were spending our time in this time of lockdown, we've been doing a lot of internal navel gazing, looking at our policies, looking at our processes, seeing where we can improve. And we identified we had a gap, which we're now going to plug. So I think it's more out of that we're going to see some changes and updates to privacy notices.
And it's also good practice to keep privacy notices under review every 12 months as well, because the business may change, as Steve was saying, and Steve had a great point there. With third parties, we're working with different organisations. You know, we need to be transparent about that. We're sharing people's personal data. It's good order to make sure that those privacy notices are kept up to date.
Excellent, thanks, Ardi. So I'm just having a look. I think we do have one new question in. I was about to mention about the global standard, and to both your points, it just feels like now is absolutely the time for a global standard when everybody's actually, looking at data, personal data, in a very similar way right now. But we do have a question that's just come in to say, is Brexit still happening by year end? So which one of you would like to start to answer that question?
Well, the government made some key announcements with respect to the negotiations and the free trade agreement that the government wanted to achieve with the European Union. That was very much clearly government policy. As far as I've last checked, that hasn't changed. That's still the case. I think what is going to be flexing is the timescale, the timetable, because if you recall, before we got this horrible, nasty disease, which none of us can see, they were talking about, well, let's see how we can get to sort of heads of agreement by June. Well, that looks incredibly impossible in the current situation, given our Prime Minister himself, sadly, is very ill at the moment. So I think we will have to revisit that timetable for the negotiations to conclude in order to have that break from the European Union, because no European Union member state can really focus on anything at the moment like our own government, apart from trying to keep the welfare and safety of all our citizens intact and making sure we can get the incidence of death decreasing. That's really, really important, I think. But yes, to answer your question, and I think Brexit will happen, and who knows? We might want a closer alignment than we did when we first started this journey.
I was watching this morning. I was looking at an article posted by the BBC on. It was an interview of the Italian Prime Minister, and it was a really good interview. In fact, some of the questions the interviewer, I thought, he's a brave man. I wouldn't be asking those sorts of questions. But what I think there are some fundamental, challenges for the union as a whole, and I've always maintained, it's good for us to be. We all live in the same area, if you like. We're all on the same continent, so it's good for us to look out for one another. And at the same time, I do respect the fact that half the population wanted to vote to leave, or maybe it's more of a case of wanted to take control back of the sovereignty. And I know that Ardi and I, in fact, the picture which you saw, which we put out, was Ardi and I having a beer and having a good discussion.
Yeah, I was a bit scared in that picture, Steve. There's something quite frightening then.
Yeah, well, I think it was because we'd got to a point where the people standing around had started to clear the bar area, thinking that we were going to start a brawl.
That's not good
because it got quite topical. It looked like Nigel Farage against, I don't know. So it was quite interesting. But yeah, back to the point of privacy. I think with all these things. As Ardi's alluded to, as the questions and as the point you're making, Vic, we are really do need to get back to some type of normality as quickly as possible. And I do welcome any ideas that I see, and Ardi's suggested that what he'd read about this how can we do this in a better way, a more effective way? And it's always about, at these times, it's a bit like our business bit. You know, we are having to be very innovative. You know, I've run 6 virtual classrooms over the last fortnight, and you know, those classrooms were meant to be in class, but they're now online. And you know, so we're having to reinvent the way we do business. Now, a wise man once told me, and I've got to tell you, because I was thinking about this last night. This wise man is actually, well, I'll tell you at the end. Right, what he said to me is, he drives me up to the airport whenever I'm traveling away on business, not because I'm a snob or anything like that, because in actual fact it's cost effective by the time I've done a train or, you know, driven and parked up, etc. So he drives me up there, and I've got to know him over the years. He's a lovely guy. David is his name. And he said, the thing is, Steve, the thing that worries me, and he used to be a London cab driver as well, so you can imagine the time. He said, the thing is, what worries me about all of this, he said, with his London accent, is that when we get back to some sort of normality, we're all going to have learnt to work differently. And therefore, there won't be the need for this international travel to go and sign a document or to shake hands and look people in the eye. And that, I think, is, you know, I didn't realise that was only a month ago. Who would have thought it, right? But that's so true. You know, we are reinventing the way that we think, the way we work. And so I welcome any way that we can get our economy back. We can get in a controlled way, not, you know, our kids can get back to school. I don't think it's good for us, for the kids not to be schooled, not just because they're driving me crazy, because we've got a fantastic tree house. You should see it. Not because of that, but because, you know, actually the whole economy drives around our family and our family unit, so we've got to support that and get it back to some type of normality as quickly as possible, but recognizing the fact we are still on that steep curve, and that's a bit scary.
Yes, for sure, for sure. So I think we're just about ready to bring it to a close, and I've really enjoyed, I know Steve will have done as well, having Ardi with us. Ardi, just before we close, any final thoughts or remarks from you on anything on the topic or what Steve has just been talking about?
I'm laughing because Steve is shamelessly plugging the Journal of Data Protection and Privacy. However, if you don't want to subscribe to it, you don't have to subscribe to the Journal. There's actually a very good, and Steve's giving me a thumbs up, so thank you, because he's in the Journal, of course. So we might well interview Steve about his article when we arrive again at the same place, the same time. If you don't want to subscribe, it's not a problem, but you can actually be part of a community of people who have connected with the Journal on LinkedIn. There are about 3,000, in fact, at the last count, which is great. And it's really, I created the Journal so it gave a voice to people who perhaps hadn't got a voice in an academic or a practitioner journal, that hadn't written an article before, or perhaps had some thoughts that they'd never had an opportunity to express to a wider audience. And it is a senior audience that the Journal is connected with. So I do welcome us to continue the conversation today in a good humour, keep a smile on our face, but also we've got a lot to learn. I know Steve and I are always talking about how much we can learn from both our clients, from each other, from others as well, and that's why we're so enthusiastic about coming out of this positively and strongly, having learnt a lot more about the profession that we love, which is of course data privacy, and for the benefit of everyone. And I always talk about, the final point I make is always having a higher sense of purpose, and it's something I've spoken to Steve at the bar many times. You know, a lot of us are in this business because we have a higher sense of purpose. We genuinely want to do better things which have a consequence not just for our clients but for the wider community. And maybe we should try to see what the advantages and benefits are of all of us going through this period now, and how we can emerge from it being stronger, more enlightened, and perhaps doing things which have a higher sense of purpose.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Ardi, and thanks for joining us. I will just round off with one question that's actually related to what both of you have just talked about the higher sense of purpose, about things probably being different when we finish this. We had a question around employment of data protection officers. It's feeling quite London-centric right now, and this particular DPO is working out of the north. So will the level of remote working happening now change the views of those global organisations that are still stuck in London? I think that's a really good question, and I think the answer is probably yes from what we've just been talking about. Steve, I think you're nodding there.
Yeah, I think I just think that that's a really good point, because I've got some really good, fantastic data protection officer friends, colleagues that I know up north, or doesn't have to be up north. They can be down in Devon and Dorset and Cornwall, or Pembrokeshire, beautiful part of the country. And they manage this. They work remotely. They are if you like, they're centres of excellence in their own right. I can go to them, I can consult with them, and really get their feedback on some fantastic stuff. And I think so prior running up to this, Boris was announcing loads of new investment measures to increase the way that we travel and things like that. And obviously the big push was to get us all connected, and I think that's got to be now one of the single biggest things. But I do also I just want to mention that next week I think we have another guest, Tom Smithson, who's a well-being counsellor, and I think that's a really good plug, because, and I didn't line that up either, so that was quite amazing. But I did, I think what Tom can bring to us and to some of our listeners is some of the well-being tips and practices that we should all be mindful of, because it is terribly solitary in this period of, my daughter, bless her, is hanging off me, following me around like a little lost sheep, and it's incredibly sad, because her interactions now are not on her age, apart from on a social media platform. And I do think that we've got to think differently now about how the remote DPO can support an organisation. You don't have to be there. It helps to have that eye-to-eye contact, but now we've got this video technology and decent cameras and the bandwidth, then this should really open up a good debate about how we structure and how we're dispersed across the country and wider.
Absolutely. Well, I look forward to seeing how that unfolds. I'm sure all of you do as well, because everything right now is changing week to week. But just remains for me to say again, thank you so much to Ardi, thank you to Steve. Have a wonderful, relaxing, happy Easter, everyone.
Yes.
And we'll see you back here next Friday at 2 p.m. And if you have missed any of the other sessions, they're all available on the Privacy Culture website. Just search for privacyculture.com, or you can search for them directly on YouTube as well. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.